Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation, maybe online, maybe just, chatting with someone, and you just hit a wall?
Oh, definitely.
Like you're talking about something happening in the world and suddenly the idea of free speech comes up and where its boundaries are, and it just feels like you're not even speaking the same language.
Yeah, it's one of those terms everyone thinks they know, but the definitions can be worlds apart.
Totally. It's a concept everyone talks about, but boy, do perceptions differ.
They absolutely do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fundamental right in many systems, but its definition, its practical limits, and crucially, how people perceive those limits can vary dramatically depending on, well, where they're coming from, their societal context and experiences.
Welcome back to Sip&Talk. I'm Sunny.
I'm Joe.
So listen, in a previous deep dive we did where we were touching on some topics related to China, we actually heard from some listeners, some living in China, and they gave us some really fascinating feedback. It went right to this exact point.
Oh, interesting. What did they say?
Well, they kind of pushed back on the idea that free speech is simply restricted in China compared to some, idealized free West or Taiwan. They said basically, hey, from our perspective, Western societies and even Taiwan don't have true free speech either. There are things you can't say, just like there are things we can't say.
Ah, okay. And that feedback is like the perfect launch pad for this deep dive, isn't it?
Exactly.
And gets right to the core misunderstanding that often happens in these kinds of cross-cultural conversations. It's not a simple binary free versus not free.
Right.
It's way more complex.
Yeah.
It involves different definitions of freedom, different types of consequences, different systems of power.
Exactly. So that's our mission today. We've gathered a bunch of information that explores these different perspectives on freedom of speech in China, the West, Taiwan, and our goal is to dive deep into this specific perception, this idea that, hey, limitations exist everywhere, and really try to understand the reasons behind it.
Right. What are the mechanisms at play in each system? What are the crucial distinctions that, frankly, often get lost in translation or maybe deliberately blurred?
Yeah, and just to be super clear up front, we are not here to take sides or make political judgments. Our job is to explore the information we've got and help you, the listener, understand the different systems and viewpoints being presented.
It's about building a clearer picture. Right. A clearer picture of how this complex concept is understood and experienced in different parts of the world based on the information available.
So think of this as your comprehensive guide to navigating this sometimes pretty confusing conversation. We're going to start by looking at why China is widely seen as having significant speech restrictions. That's kind of the baseline view for many. Then we're going to flip the script and explore why some Chinese individuals might see limitations in the West and Taiwan.
And unpack that you have limits too argument.
Exactly. And the crucial part, we'll spend a good amount of time unpacking the core differences in how free speech is understood across these societies. We'll focus on what freedom really means in these contexts and what kind of consequences are involved, using specific examples to make it clear.
Yeah, it's about giving you the framework to distinguish between different types of limitations and understand the underlying systems that create them. It's not all the same thing.
All right, let's jump right in. We'll start with the perspective that's perhaps most commonly discussed in, many parts of the world, the view that free speech is significantly restricted in China.
Okay, so the analysis points to a very clear primary reason for this perception. The Chinese government maintains strict and really pervasive censorship and control over media, the internet, and essentially all forms of public discourse.
And this isn't just about, blocking a few websites, right? It's described as a much more multi-layered system. What are some of the specific ways this control is exercised?
Well, a major pillar is internet censorship, famously known as the Great Firewall. This is a sophisticated technical system constantly being updated, designed to filter out content the government deems sensitive or undesirable. And importantly, it blocks access to a huge number of foreign websites and online services.
So we're talking major international sites people use every day elsewhere.
Oh, yeah. Things like Wikipedia, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, many major international news outlets like the New York Times, BBC, a lot of stuff. If you're inside China, accessing these generally requires special tools like VPNs, and even those are often targeted and interfered with by the government.
So it's like an actual digital border patrol deciding what information gets in and out? That's intense.
It is, but it goes far beyond just blocking access to foreign sites. The domestic internet, the platforms people do use daily, like Weibo, WeChat, Douyin, they're subject to intense monitoring and content moderation.
How does that work?
There are, armies of human sensors, but also increasingly sophisticated AI tools that constantly scan posts, comments, articles, even sometimes private messages for keywords or topics that are considered sensitive.
And what kind of topics trigger this? What are they looking for?
Well, basically anything that could potentially challenge the ruling Communist Party's authority or question its narrative, or, heaven forbid, organize any form of collective action outside of party control.
So really political stuff.
Political stuff, yeah, but also historical events they want to control the narrative on.
Yeah.
Like the Tiananmen Square crackdown in '89. Any mention is usually scrubbed. Also, references to democracy, political reform, human rights lawyers, rights defense movements, sensitive ethnic issues like in Xinjiang or Tibet, certain religious topics.
Wow, that's a broad net.
It is. And sometimes it includes even seemingly innocuous things that take on political meaning. Remember the whole Winnie the Pooh thing? Comparing the leader to Winnie the Pooh got censored because it was seen as mockery?
Right, I remember that. So posts or accounts discussing any of this stuff.
They're swiftly deleted, or the content is restricted so only the user can see it, or the account might get suspended or even shut down entirely.
So it's not just the big political stuff, it's anything that might rock the boat, even humor if it touches the wrong nerve.
Correct. The scope of what's deemed sensitive can be incredibly broad and, honestly, sometimes unpredictable. It changes. Beyond the internet, you've got comprehensive media control.
Right, traditional media.
Almost all traditional media outlets, television, radio, newspapers, major news websites, are either directly owned by the state or party, or they're very tightly controlled by the Communist Party's propaganda departments.
So journalists have to toe the line.
They're expected to, and often legally required to, report news in a way that aligns with the official government and party line. There's very, very little space for independent journalism that's critical of the government or investigates sensitive topics.
And what happens if they try?
Journalists, or even just citizens who try to report outside these official channels or dig into things the government doesn't want discussed, often face severe consequences. Harassment, detention, losing their jobs, or even lengthy prison sentences on vague charges.
And this ties into the legal framework, doesn't it? It's not just guidelines. There are laws backing this up.
Oh, absolutely. Laws like the National Security Law, the Cybersecurity Law, and various provisions in the criminal code are used to legitimize this control. And these laws often use very broad and vaguely defined terms.
Like what?
Things like inciting subversion of state power, splitting the country, leaking state secrets, picking quarrels and provoking trouble, or spreading rumors.
Picking quarrels and provoking trouble. That sounds incredibly subjective. How do you even define that legally?
Well, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
It is incredibly subjective. The vagueness gives the authorities immense discretion to apply these laws to virtually any speech they dislike, especially political speech or criticism of the party or government.
So you don't need to be, actively plotting revolution. Just saying the wrong thing online could fit.
Potentially, yes. Publishing critical comments, sharing information the government deems a rumor, even if it later turns out true, or organizing peaceful protests can be interpreted under these laws.
So the laws themselves become tools for censorship, not just rules for society.
Precisely. And the combined effect of all this, the technical censorship, the media control, the broad legal restrictions, leads to this fourth, very powerful mechanism. Self-censorship.
Ah, yeah, the chilling effect.
Exactly. When individuals know their online activity is monitored, know that discussing certain topics can lead to their posts vanishing, their accounts being shut down, or worse, getting a visit from the police or facing legal trouble, they internalize this fear.
They start censoring themselves before anyone else even has to step in.
Exactly. People learn what topics are taboo, what lines not to cross, and they just avoid discussing them in public forums.
Yeah.
Maybe even in private communications they suspect might be monitored, like on WeChat.
And that shrinks the space for open discussion way more than just deleting posts.
Far more effectively. It dramatically limits the space for open discussion, critical thinking, and the free exchange of ideas within society. It creates this pervasive chilling effect.
that chilling effect sounds incredibly impactful. It's not just about what the government actively stops, but what people stop themselves from saying out of fear, or maybe just out of learned habit.
It really shapes the whole public sphere.
So, okay, that paints a very clear picture of why China is widely seen as having these systemic, state-driven speech restrictions. But, as you mentioned at the start, the analysis also points out that many Chinese people feel they do have free speech. How do we reconcile those two seemingly contradictory perspectives?
This is where understanding the lived experience within that specific context becomes absolutely crucial. The material suggests several reasons why this feeling of freedom can exist alongside those systemic restrictions we just outlined.
Okay, what are they?
First, for many people, their daily lives just don't consistently bump up against the wall of censorship. They can talk pretty freely about, entertainment, movies, music, food, family stuff, personal relationships, their jobs, as long as it's not organizing, everyday complaints like traffic or pollution, consumer goods. There's a vast range of non-political or non-sensitive topics.
Okay, so if your conversations mostly stick to, say, the latest TV drama or where to get the best hot pot, you probably feel pretty uninhibited. You can say what you want.
Exactly. And for individuals whose primary focus is on these aspects of life, that feels like freedom of expression. They can say what they want about those things.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, there's the aspect of adaptation and normalization. People who have grown up and lived their entire lives within this system of pervasive censorship and information control might simply perceive it as the normal state of affairs, or even as necessary for stability.
Like the fish and water analogy, again, they might not have a reference point for what a truly open public discourse looks like, or they might not miss something they've never really had.
A bit like that, yeah. They might not fully realize the extent of the restrictions compared to other places. Or they might view the state's control not as censorship in a negative sense, but as legitimate management or guidance of public opinion, maybe for the sake of social harmony or preventing chaos.
So they might genuinely see it as a positive thing, or at least a necessary trade-off for order.
For some, yes, absolutely. And this often ties into the third factor mentioned, nationalism. A strong sense of national pride, maybe fueled by economic development and the state's narrative, can lead some individuals to accept limitations on individual freedoms, including speech as a necessary sacrifice, or even a contribution to the collective good, to national strength and stability.
So criticizing the system feels like criticizing China itself.
For some, it gets framed that way. They might see Western criticism of China's censorship not as a concern for human rights, but as an attack on China's rise, or an attempt to destabilize the country. So they align their personal perception of freedom with the state's narrative.
Okay, nationalism is a powerful force. What's the fourth factor?
Information isolation. This ties directly back to the Great Firewall and media control. Because access to foreign news sources, unfiltered historical information, diverse global opinions, and critical perspectives from outside China is severely restricted, many people simply aren't exposed to the content that is being censored.
So if you don't ever try to access, say, a blocked news site, or if you don't know about certain historical events because they're never mentioned, you don't feel the censorship directly.
Precisely. You don't see the blocked websites unless you're actively looking with the right tools. You don't hear the dissenting voices if they're scrubbed from domestic platforms. So people might genuinely believe the censored information doesn't exist, isn't important, is inaccurate, or is just Western propaganda, as the state often frames it.
Wow. So lack of awareness about what's actually being restricted contributes significantly to the feeling that their own speech isn't restricted because maybe they haven't tried to say those specific things or access that specific information.
Exactly. It's a powerful combination of factors. Freedom in daily non-political life, normalization of the system, nationalist acceptance, and information isolation. It shows that the feeling of having free speech can be very real and subjectively valid for individuals within that system, even while objective, systemic, state-imposed restrictions are undeniably in place.
It's definitely a complex picture, not simple black and white at all.
Understanding this kind of dual reality, the objective mechanisms of state control versus the subjective experience shaped by environment, information access, and sometimes ideology is really key to grasping the different perspectives in this whole debate.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about the system, yes, but also very much about perception shaped by context. Okay, let's pivot now to that feedback that sparked this whole deep dive. The idea that some Chinese individuals believe the West and Taiwan also lack true free speech. How is that claim typically framed?
Well, this claim often arises when individuals from within China observe instances in Western societies or Taiwan where someone faces negative consequences, maybe backlash, maybe losing a job for something they've said.
Okay.
They might acknowledge that China has its own restrictions, sure, but then they point to these instances elsewhere and say, essentially, look, you're not so different. You also have things you can't say freely. It becomes a sort of whataboutism.
And is there a specific example that's commonly used to illustrate this point, something that really resonates?
Yes. A very frequently cited example, according to the material we looked at, is the idea or the observation that you cannot insult others.
Cannot insult others. Okay.
When they see people in the West or Taiwan facing criticism, boycotts, getting fired, or having to apologize for saying things deemed offensive, discriminatory, racist, sexist, homophobic, or just plain insulting, they interpret this as a fundamental limit on free speech, similar in nature to the limits they experience back home.
So they see someone penalized, maybe socially or professionally, for saying something offensive, and they equate that penalty with the state censorship they know. Like, see, you said something bad, you got punished. Same thing.
Exactly. They see a consequence for speech and assume it must be the same kind of restriction, stemming from the same kind of authority. But this is where the crucial distinction lies, and it's perhaps the most important concept to really grasp in this entire discussion. It's the core of the confusion.
Okay, let's get right into that then. The material draws a really clear line between social consequences or legal consequences within a democratic framework and government censorship in an authoritarian one. What's the fundamental difference here?
The core difference is the source and the nature of the consequence. In free democratic societies, like those in the West and Taiwan, the fundamental principle of freedom of speech is primarily the right to be free from government interference or punishment for expressing your views.
So the government can't just shut you up or arrest you because they don't like what you say.
Precisely. The state's power to silence you is severely restricted by law, constitutions, and independent courts. There are exceptions, but they are meant to be narrow and clearly defined. However, and this is the critical part that often gets misunderstood or misrepresented, this freedom from government interference does not mean that your speech is free from any consequences whatsoever.
Ah, okay, that's the key. So the government can't stop you, but that doesn't mean nobody else can react or that there are no boundaries at all.
Exactly. Your speech exists within a society. And that society meaning other citizens, groups, private organizations, your employer, the media can and does react to what you say. Let's break this down further using the comparisons provided.
Yeah, lay it out for us. Comparing the systems side by side seems helpful.
Okay, first, let's consider the legal limits on speech. Democratic societies do have laws that restrict certain narrow categories of speech. Things like direct incitement to imminent violence, defamation, making false statements that harm someone's reputation, perjury, true threats, sometimes specific laws against hate speech, though these vary a lot, as we'll get into.
Right, there are legal lines.
Yes, but crucially, these limits are generally defined by law, they're debated publicly, they can be challenged in court, and they're applied through an independent judicial system. If you're accused of violating these laws, you have rights, the right to a lawyer, a fair trial, appeals. Judges interpret the law based on precedent and evidence.
So there are legal boundaries, but ideally they are relatively clear, publicly known, and applied through a transparent, independent process.
Right, that's the ideal anyway. Now compare this to authoritarian systems like China. While they also have laws, the restrictions on speech often rely on those incredibly broad, vague terms we mentioned earlier, those pocket crimes like inciting subversion, picking quarrels, disturbing public order.
The ones that can mean almost anything the authorities want them to mean.
Exactly. And they are not applied through an independent judiciary following clear legal precedents. They're even applied arbitrarily by the police, state security, or administrative bodies controlled directly by the state or the ruling party, often behind closed doors.
So the boundaries aren't clear, the application is unpredictable, and the process isn't independent or transparent. Huge difference right there.
Massive. Okay, second point, the nature of the consequences. In democracies, when someone says something offensive, controversial, or even hateful, that doesn't cross the line into illegal incitement. The consequences often come from society.
What does that look like?
People might criticize them publicly, fiercely debate them, argue with them. Maybe they organize boycotts against their business. Maybe they petition their employer to take action. Maybe there are protests. Maybe news outlets condemn them.
So these are reactions from other citizens, groups, or private organizations using their speech and actions.
Yes. The consequence might be public shaming, loss of reputation, losing followers, getting deplatformed by a private company, or maybe losing a job. but typically because the employer, a private entity, reacts to public backlash, decides the speech violated company policy or values, or damaged the company's reputation.
Okay, so it's pressure from the public or decisions by non-government actors.
Right. Now, in authoritarian systems, the consequences for saying something politically sensitive or critical of the state come directly and often immediately from state power.
Like what we discussed before, getting arrested, interrogated, maybe disappearing for a while.
Precisely. It's the police knocking on your door. It's internet regulators shutting down your social media account on government orders. It's the state pressuring your university or employer to fire you for political reasons. The consequences wielded by the coercive power of the state apparatus itself.
That's a fundamental difference. One is a reaction by society or private actors. The other is punishment by the state. It's about who holds the power to impose the consequence.
It absolutely is. And this leads directly to the third point. Who decides what speech is acceptable and what the consequences are? In democracies, it's more distributed. Consequences for speech might be decided by an independent court for actual legal violations, or they emerge from the collective actions and opinions of the public, the media landscape, or decisions made by private entities like companies or universities setting their own codes of conduct.
It's messy, maybe, but not controlled by one single entity.
Right, whereas in an authoritarian system like China, it's decided by the state, the ruling party, the police, the propaganda department, the internet censorship bureaucracy. It's a highly centralized top-down system of control.
So the party or government basically decides what's permissible and what the punishment is, often without any public debate or independent review.
Yes. And finally, the fourth point, the ability to challenge the consequence. In democracies, if you are penalized for speech, especially if it's a legal penalty, but even sometimes with social or professional consequences, you generally have avenues for appeal or pushback. You can challenge the application of a law in court, argue your case publicly, sue for wrongful termination in some cases, try to sway public opinion. There's usually a process, however imperfect, for challenging decisions and seeking recourse.
You can fight back, at least in principle.
Exactly. In authoritarian systems, particularly for politically sensitive speech, there is often no meaningful judicial remedy or public recourse. Administrative orders to delete content, shut down accounts, or detain individuals are often final and cannot be effectively challenged through an independent legal process. The system is designed primarily to enforce the state's will, not to protect individual rights against the state.
Okay, that four-point comparison, legal limits, nature of consequences, who decides, and ability to challenge really clarifies things. So going back to the example, when someone from China sees, say, an American celebrity lose an endorsement deal or a professor get fired after making racist or discriminatory remarks that caused huge public outcry,
they might look at that job loss or lost deal and think, see, censorship, you can't say that, and if you do, you lose your job. It's the same.
But based on this distinction, that's missing the crucial point.
And that's exactly the core of the misunderstanding, according to the analysis we reviewed. They see the negative consequence, job loss, public condemnation, and equate it with the form of consequence they understand best, which is state punishment or state-enforced silence.
Right.
But they fail to recognize that the source of that consequence in a democracy is typically the employer reacting to public pressure, or upholding company values against discrimination, or protecting your brand image, or it's the public expressing outrage. It's not the government ordering the employer to fire the person or ordering the public to be outraged.
Ah, I see. It's fundamentally confusing the reaction from society, other people, companies, with censorship by the state. It's like if you get kicked out of a private club for breaking its rules, you wouldn't say the government censored you, right? The club has its own rules.
That's a good analogy. Or getting fired for consistently insulting your customers. The consequence is real, maybe even harsh, but its origin and the system behind it are fundamentally different. One is a function of living and speaking within a complex society with diverse values, competing interests, and private actors making their own choices. The other is the direct suppression of expression by an authoritarian state, power-wielding coercive force.
Understanding that distinction, consequences from the state versus consequences from society, private entities, or via clear legal frameworks applied by independent courts, is just paramount for accurately comparing these systems and understanding what free speech actually means in practice.
Absolutely critical.
That distinction is really powerful. It reframes the whole conversation away from are there any consequences to where do the consequences come from and why. Okay, so even with that core difference clear, are there areas in democracies where the practice of free speech still feels tricky or runs into challenges, even if it's not state censorship?
Oh, absolutely. Nobody's claiming the system is perfect or without friction. While the principle of freedom from state censorship is strong, navigating speech within complex, diverse, and often polarized societies presents its own set of challenges and debates. One prominent example discussed is what's often called cancel culture.
Right, cancel culture, a phrase you hear constantly these days. Very loaded term.
Very loaded, and used in many different ways. But the analysis acknowledges that, yes, social pressure campaigns aimed at boycotting, deplatforming, or ostracizing individuals for their expressed views are a real phenomenon. They can create difficult situations, chilling effects of a different kind, maybe.
Is there an example mentioned?
It mentions the example of J.K. Rowling, who faced significant public criticism, backlash, calls for boycotts, and disavowal from some associated with her work due to her comments concerning transgender issues.
Right. She voiced opinions that many people found offensive or harmful and then faced widespread condemnation and attempts to, well, cancel her association with beloved franchises.
Exactly. That while this social pressure can feel like a restriction and certainly has consequences for the target, the criticism and pressure she faced came from other citizens exercising their own free speech and actions.
So people were free to criticize her, free to disagree strongly, free to organize boycotts or sign petitions. That's their speech and association rights at play.
Precisely. It's speech reacting to speech. It's association choices being made. It's not the government stepping in to silence her or punish her for her views. It's society reacting, sometimes very harshly, sometimes maybe unfairly in the eyes of some, to speech it finds objectionable.
So it's more like a messy, noisy, sometimes uncomfortable public debate playing out through social and economic pressure, rather than the state silencing one side.
That's the distinction being drawn.
Yeah.
The analysis also points out that within democratic systems, even these contentious situations involving social pressure or cancel culture can often be debated publicly themselves. The person being canceled or their allies can push back, argue their case, criticize the critics. Sometimes public opinion shifts or they find other platforms.
So the conversation about the cancellation and the original controversial speech itself is allowed to happen. And even the social outcome isn't necessarily final or beyond challenge.
Yes. The analysis offers Elon Musk as an interesting example here. It notes his very public, often provocative challenges to what he perceives as cancel culture or overly restrictive content moderation, particularly now owning Twitter.
Right, he talks about it all the time.
And the very fact that he can openly, loudly, and repeatedly critique these phenomena, often targeting specific groups or institutions, without facing judicial suppression or censorship from the state, is presented as an illustration of the underlying fundamental freedom of speech that allows such debates, however fraught, to even occur.
That's a good point. You can loudly complain about being canceled or about others being canceled in a system where the state isn't the one doing the canceling. The debate itself is protected.
Right. Now, the analysis does also touch briefly on another area that adds complexity, particularly in our digital age. The role of large social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc. It references Elon Musk and X here.
Because these platforms do remove content or suspend accounts, right?
They absolutely do. And this is sometimes pointed to as a form of censorship. But the distinction made is that these are private companies making their own decisions about content moderation based on their terms of service.
So a platform like X deciding to remove a post or ban a user isn't the government doing it. It's a private company enforcing its own rules.
Exactly. Now, the decisions of these incredibly powerful platforms have immense impact on public discourse, no question. And they raise really important questions about corporate power, consistency, transparency, appeals processes. It's a huge ongoing debate. But structurally, the analysis implies they operate as private entities setting their own rules within the bounds of legal requirements like removing illegal content, which is different from state censorship enforced directly by government law or decree.
So it's maybe a gray area because of the sheer influence these platforms have. They function like a public square in some ways, but technically it's distinct from direct state action controlling speech.
That's the line being drawn. So yeah, challenges and complexities exist in democracies around speech, absolutely. But they often involve these dynamics: social pressure, public debate, private platform policies, rather than the direct, top-down state suppression seen in authoritarian systems.
Okay, that nuance is important. Now let's talk more about how these differences are sometimes deliberately framed or maybe weaponized in arguments. The analysis mentioned Chinese nationalist discourse using a mirror strategy or a kind of "you're not so great either" logic. Tell us more about that.
Yes, this is described as a pretty calculated communication strategy, often employed within Chinese state-backed media or nationalist online circles. The goal is to deflect criticism of China's human rights record, especially its lack of free speech, by accusing other countries, particularly Western democracies, of hypocrisy. It's a common tactic used in what some call opinion warfare or information statecraft.
You're not so great either. It's basically a way of saying you have no right to criticize us because you have problems too. A classic deflection.
Precisely. The analysis provides a clear example of this kind of phrasing, something like, you say we censor discussions about sensitive history, but we also see you don't let people talk nonsense about homosexuality or race. Or they might point to hate speech laws in Germany, for example.
Okay, so they take a specific social taboo or a legal boundary, like a hate speech law that exists in some other country, and use it to try and invalidate any criticism of China's fundamentally different and far more extensive system of state control over all political dissent.
Exactly. It's an attempt to create a false equivalence between vastly different types of limitations applied in vastly different ways by vastly different actors.
And the analysis points out the flaw in this logic, right?
It does. The underlying argument boils down to, since you also have some boundaries, or some speech faces negative consequences in your society, you have no moral standing or right to say that my system, which suppresses all criticism of the ruling party, lacks freedom. But this completely ignores the fundamental differences in the nature, the scope, the transparency, and the enforcement of those boundaries.
Okay, let's quickly revisit those key differences we talked about earlier to see exactly how this mirror strategy falls apart when you examine it closely.
Right. First, transparency and legal basis. Democratic limits, like those on hate speech in Germany or defamation laws everywhere, are generally based on publicly debated laws. They have defined terms, even if debated, judicial oversight, and precedent. You can see the law, understand its intended scope, usually protecting specific groups or reputations, and you can challenge its application in court.
You know the rules of the game, more or less.
Right. Chinese limits, on the other hand, rely heavily on those vague, catch-all pocket crimes, inciting subversion, picking quarrels, and administrative orders that are applied arbitrarily by the party state, often without transparency or any meaningful independent review. The rules are unclear, shifting, and politically determined.
So one system has known rules applied through a process, even if imperfectly. The other has unknown or flexible rules applied by political fiat. Big difference.
Huge. Second, the space for fundamental critique. In democracies, you have extensive freedom, legally protected, to openly criticize the entire political system, the government, its policies, its leaders, often intensely, harshly, even irreverently. That's core political speech.
Think about political cartoons, protests, editorials.
Exactly. In China, direct criticism of the government, the Communist Party, or the paramount leader is extremely risky. It's routinely censored and frequently leads to severe state retaliation, account deletion, job loss, police visits, detention, imprisonment. The system itself is off limits for fundamental critique.
So you can criticize the whole system and the leaders in one place, but you absolutely cannot do that safely in the other. That's a gigantic gap.
A fundamental one, yeah. And third, the enforcement body. Who enforces the limits? In democracies, consequences might involve independent courts applying law, or public opinion exerting pressure, or private actors making decisions. While imperfect, it's a relatively decentralized system with potential checks and balances, including a free press that can report on abuses. In China, enforcement is centralized within the party state military apparatus. It's the police, state security, propaganda departments, internet regulators, all working in concert, specifically designed for political control and suppression of dissent. There are no independent checks on this power when it comes to political speech.
So the state itself has the direct, unchecked power to silence you, and there's no real way to fight it effectively within the system if you've crossed a political line.
Correct. So the analysis makes it clear that this mirror strategy, pointing to perceived flaws or specific limitations in other countries, while maybe superficially appealing as a debating tactic, completely fails to account for these massive fundamental differences in transparency, the scope of permissible speech, especially political critique, the source of consequences, state versus society law, and the mechanisms of enforcement.
It's basically a rhetorical deflection, a way to change the subject that doesn't stand up to a detailed comparison of how the systems actually function in reality.
Exactly. It avoids the core issues by trying to muddy the waters and imply a false equivalence, saying everywhere is basically the same, when the lived realities of speech are clearly vastly different.
That helps make it really clear why that kind of argument, while you hear it a lot, is misleading. It deliberately ignores the qualitative differences.
Okay, stepping back a bit now, the material suggests there might be an even deeper issue at play here. Maybe a fundamental difference in how the very concepts of freedom and social responsibility are understood in the first place.
Yes, this gets to the philosophical underpinnings, the core values. The analysis identifies what seems to be a significant gap, or at least a very different emphasis, in how these key terms are defined and prioritized in different cultural and political contexts.
Okay, so how is freedom typically understood in, say, the Western or Taiwanese context described in the material? In that understanding, freedom, especially freedom of speech, is generally seen as freedom with boundaries. It's a core individual right, yes, the right to express yourself, challenge power, share ideas, but that right is understood to exist alongside and be balanced with responsibilities.
Responsibilities like what?
The responsibility to respect the rights and dignity of others, and the responsibility to abide by established, democratically agreed upon legal norms, like not engaging in defamation that ruins someone's life, or not inciting immediate violence against a group. Your freedom isn't absolute. It generally ends where someone else's fundamental rights begin, or where it poses a direct, imminent threat defined by law.
Okay, freedom balanced with responsibility and legal limits. And what about the role of society or the group in this view?
Within this framework, the role of the collective citizens, society is often seen as having a crucial role in supervising and critiquing the government. A free media acts as a vital check on state power. And the concept of cannot insult people, when it translates into things like hate speech laws or strong social norms against discrimination, isn't just seen as an arbitrary taboo. It's often framed as a way to protect vulnerable groups, uphold equality, and foster a certain kind of inclusive civil society.
So restrictions against, say, racist hate speech are often justified as protecting marginalized groups and reflecting societal values like anti-racism, rather than just shutting down speech the majority dislikes.
Precisely. Now contrast this with the alternative concept of freedom, sometimes held by some individuals within China, as presented in the analysis. Their understanding of freedom can at times lean towards the idea of the right to say almost anything without facing negative consequences, especially social ones.
So in that view, true freedom means zero repercussions, ever, for anything you might say. No criticism, no social disapproval, no job loss.
That interpretation seems to exist, yeah. And in this alternative view, the role of the group or society is often seen differently, perhaps prioritizing collective harmony, stability, and obedience to the state above individual expression, especially critical expression. The media's primary role might be seen as maintaining social order and supporting the official narrative, not challenging power.
Okay, so a different emphasis on the individual versus the collective and the role of media.
Right. And within this framework, the idea of cannot insult people might be perceived quite differently. Not necessarily as a principle protecting vulnerable groups, but perhaps more simply as another topic that is off limits, another restriction that prevents open, potentially harsh, critical, or truthful, in their view, discussion.
So it's seen more as just another taboo that limits conversation, rather than a principle designed to protect individuals or foster specific social values like equality.
Potentially, yes. This fundamental difference in defining freedom itself, whether it inherently includes boundaries, responsibilities towards others, and legal limits, or whether it's perceived primarily as the absence of any negative reaction or consequence, seems to be a root cause of the differing perceptions and the difficulty in having a shared conversation about free speech. People might be operating from entirely different foundational definitions of the core concept.
That's incredibly insightful. It's not just about listing restrictions on a scorecard. It's about the very meaning and value assigned to the words we use, like freedom and responsibility.
Okay, let's look at Taiwan as a specific case study, as the material does. We mentioned earlier that some individuals in China claim that Taiwan also restricts pro-China speech. How does the analysis address this specific claim?
Right, this claim is often used to try and fit Taiwan into that "you're not so great either" false equivalence narrative. However, the analysis provides quite specific counter-evidence to show this claim doesn't really hold up when you look at the actual situation on the ground in Taiwan.
We'll be right back. I just want to give another shout out to Mickey from Mickey to Life. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
The analysis points out several things. First, in Taiwan, political parties that openly advocate for unification with mainland China exist legally and operate openly. They participate in elections, hold rallies, have members.
So you can literally have a political party whose platform is unification with the PRC.
Yes. Second, there are media outlets. The analysis mentions certain television stations like CTI specifically as an example, but also newspapers and online commentators who express viewpoints that are clearly supportive of unification or align closely with Beijing's perspective on cross-strait relations.
So pro-China media exists and broadcasts?
It does. Third, the analysis mentions specific public figures, maybe politicians, maybe entertainers, maybe academics who are well known for their pro-China stance and express these opinions publicly, sometimes very vocally, on television, in print, online, at public events.
Okay. And the crucial question.
Yeah.
Are these parties, media outlets, or individuals arrested, shut down, or censored by the government simply for holding and expressing these pro-China or pro-unification views?
According to the analysis, the answer is generally no. Now, it's crucial to add that these parties, media outlets, and individuals often face significant public criticism, political opposition, protests, and intense controversy within Taiwan's very vibrant and often polarized democratic debate. That's the social and political consequence playing out.
Right. People disagree strongly, and they say so.
Exactly. But the key distinction is that the government does not typically arrest them, shut down their operations, or censor their publications simply because their views are pro-China or pro-unification. There have been complex cases like CTI losing its broadcast license renewal over issues related to accuracy and influence, which sparked huge debate about media regulation versus political interference. But the analysis frames the general environment as one where pro-unification opinions can be and are expressed publicly.
That's a pretty stark contrast to the situation for, say, pro-independence advocates in mainland China or even just critics of the CCP.
It is. It directly contradicts the simplistic claim that pro-China speech is censored by the Taiwanese government in the same way dissenting speech is censored in the PRC. What the analysis clarifies is that Taiwan's actual challenge in this context is something different.
Which is?
It's not about suppressing internal dissenting views, but rather how to safeguard its democratic system, its elections, and its public information environment from hostile propaganda, disinformation campaigns, and cognitive warfare operations conducted from the mainland by the PRC state apparatus.
Okay. So the challenge is dealing with external interference and deliberate state-sponsored manipulation aimed at undermining their democracy, not about silencing its own citizens who happen to hold pro-China views.
Exactly. The analysis frames this primarily as a national security issue. How does an open, democratic society defend itself against deliberate, covert, state-sponsored efforts to manipulate its public discourse and democratic processes rather than a restriction on legitimate internal freedom of speech or opinion? It's a crucial distinction. Defending against external state manipulation versus suppressing internal political viewpoints.
That Taiwan case study really brings the differences to life with concrete examples of what is actually permissible, even if controversial, versus what is claimed. Okay, speaking of concrete examples, let's quickly revisit those classic case comparisons from the material we looked at. They do a really good job of highlighting the wildly different consequences for specific types of speech in these different systems.
Yeah, they really lay bare the practical difference. They move beyond abstract principles. Let's take a few hypothetical but representative examples based on the analogy.
Yeah, what's the first one?
Imagine someone publicly expressing support for Xinjiang independence. In most democratic societies, you are legally free to voice this opinion. Now, would you face consequences? Almost certainly, yes. You'd likely face intense social and political blowback, strong disagreement, public criticism, maybe protests, being labeled with various negative terms by others online and offline, given the extreme political sensitivity of the issue.
Right. The social reaction would be intense, but the state
would generally not arrest or imprison you simply for holding and expressing that view peacefully. It's protected political speech, however unpopular or controversial. Now, compare that to China. Expressing support for Xinjiang independence is explicitly classified by the state as splittist activity, a very severe political crime.
So it's illegal, per se.
Yes. Doing so publicly or even sometimes perceived private advocacy would almost certainly lead to immediate arrest, likely severe legal penalties under national security laws, and potentially a lengthy prison sentence.
Okay, that's a massive difference in consequences. Social backlash versus state imprisonment for the exact same expression. What's the second case comparison?
Criticizing the government's handling of a major crisis, using the COVID-19 pandemic as a stark example. In the United States, think about figures like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was central to the government's public health response. He faced constant, often incredibly harsh, criticism and questioning.
Oh yeah, from politicians, media, the public.
Exactly. He was grilled publicly by politicians in congressional hearings. He was lambasted daily by media commentators across the political spectrum. His decisions and statements were debated and attacked relentlessly by the public online and off.
The government's response and his role in it was under a constant critical microscope.
Absolutely. And while he faced immense public and political pressure, Dr. Fauci and other officials were not arrested, silenced by the state, or imprisoned for the criticism they received or the policies they enacted. Now compare this to China during the early stages of the outbreak.
Right, Dr. Li Wenliang comes to mind.
Exactly. Initial attempts by individuals like Dr. Li Wenliang in Wuhan to simply share factual information about the emerging virus with colleagues were met with official reprimands and silencing by the authorities for spreading rumors. Other citizen journalists, lawyers, or academics who tried to report independently from Wuhan, document the reality on the ground, or organize efforts to criticize the official handling of the crisis, face harassment, detention, disappearance, and imprisonment.
So in one system, the government figure faces intense public criticism. In the other, the citizen critic of the government faces state punishment and silencing. That's worlds apart.
Fundamentally different dynamics. One involves public accountability, however messy, through debate and media scrutiny. The other involves state suppression of inconvenient information and dissent. Okay, final comparison.
Mocking the president or the leader.
Right. In democratic societies, the U.S., Taiwan, European countries, mocking the head of state is widely accepted, even expected, as part of political satire and free expression.
It's a staple of comedy shows, newspaper cartoons, online memes.
Constantly. The analysis mentions examples like U.S. Presidents Trump and Biden, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te. They are frequent subjects of caricature, jokes, harsh criticism, and ridicule in mainstream media and public discourse every single day, generally without any legal repercussions for the critics or comedians.
If you arrested people for mocking the president in the U.S., you'd need a lot more jails.
Indeed. It's seen as protected speech, sometimes even framed as a healthy sign of a free society's ability to hold power accountable and not take its leaders too seriously. Now, in China, mocking the leader, Xi Jinping, is highly sensitive and carries significant political risk.
We mentioned the Winnie the Pooh thing.
Exactly. Online references, images, or jokes deemed disrespectful are immediately censored. Individuals who persist, or whose mockery gains wider attention, or who make more direct criticisms can face serious consequences. Account deletion, warnings from police, job loss, and even criminal charges like insulting the head of state or picking quarrels leading to imprisonment.
So in one place, it's comedy or commentary, maybe harsh but legal. In the other, it's a potential crime against the state. These case comparisons really drive home the fundamental difference in the level of risk and the type of consequence you face for various kinds of speech, depending entirely on whether you are in a democratic system that protects political dissent or an authoritarian one that suppresses it.
They absolutely do. They move the discussion from abstract principles about freedom to the concrete, sometimes brutal, outcomes for individuals, illustrating the vast gap in the practical reality of free expression.
Right. Okay, now going back for a moment to those legal boundaries that do exist in democracies, specifically around hate speech. We touched on this, but the analysis acknowledged that democracies themselves have differing standards here. This seems like an important nuance to understand when comparing systems to avoid oversimplification.
It is really important. While democracies generally share that core commitment to freedom from state censorship of political opinion, they approach the specific question of speech that harms, demeans, or incites hatred against specific groups very differently. And these differences are often deeply shaped by their unique national histories and values.
Can you walk us through the specific examples given in the material? Germany, Sweden, the US, and Taiwan. How do they differ?
Sure. Let's start with Germany. Germany has some of the strictest hate speech laws among Western democracies. Their laws broadly prohibit inciting hatred, violence, or discrimination against specific groups based on race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, and so on. And crucially, they specifically criminalize denying the Holocaust or glorifying the Nazi regime.
And the historical context here is absolutely key, isn't it? You can't understand German law without understanding WWII.
Paramount. The analysis makes it very clear. These strict laws are a direct, conscious result of Germany confronting its Nazi past and the horrific atrocities committed during the Holocaust. The laws are explicitly designed to prevent the kind of dehumanizing hate speech that preceded and facilitated those crimes, and to protect minority groups from facing similar threats today.
So it's rooted in a specific traumatic history, and there are real penalties.
Yes, violations can result in significant penalties, including fines and even prison sentences. And under laws like the NetzDG, social media platforms face huge fines if they fail to promptly remove illegal hate speech content reported by users.
Okay, so a strong emphasis on preventing historical repetition and protecting groups. What about Sweden?
Sweden also has quite robust laws prohibiting speech that expresses threats or contempt towards groups based on factors like race, color, national or ethnic origin, religious belief, or sexual orientation. The analysis notes these laws were recently expanded to include criminalizing the denial of certain genocides.
And the reasoning there?
This approach is described as aligning with Sweden's strong tradition of social democracy and its political culture, which emphasizes equality, social solidarity, and anti-discrimination. Penalties here can also range from fines to imprisonment, depending on the severity.
So again, a strong emphasis on protecting groups from hatred and contempt, rooted in their societal values of equality. Now, how does the United States approach compare to Germany and Sweden? It's often seen as different.
It is notably different, yes. While there are laws against inciting imminent violence, fighting words, or making true threats against individuals, and there are civil laws and workplace institutional rules against harassment and discrimination, there is no broad federal law in the U.S. that criminalizes hate speech, simply based on its hateful content or its offense to specific groups.
So speech can be hateful, racist, offensive, but still legally protected.
Generally, yes, under the First Amendment of the Constitution. The legal standard for restricting speech is very high, typically requiring proof that the speech is intended and likely to produce imminent lawless action. Offensive ideas themselves, even deeply offensive ones, are usually protected.
Why such a different approach?
The analysis explains this reflects the strong emphasis in U.S. constitutional history and jurisprudence on individual liberty, freedom of conscience, and the belief, often called the marketplace of ideas, theory that even offensive or wrong ideas should be countered with more speech, debate, and evidence rather than being suppressed by the government. The focus is overwhelmingly on protecting the speaker from the state.
That's a very different philosophical basis than the German or Swedish focus on protecting groups from the harm of the speech itself. Okay, and finally, what about Taiwan?
Taiwan, according to the analysis, currently does not have comprehensive laws specifically targeting group-based hate speech in the way Germany or Sweden do. Its criminal laws do provide penalties, but primarily for individual defamation, making false statements that harm a specific person's reputation.
So less focus on protecting groups as a whole from hateful speech.
Legally, yes, in terms of specific hate speech statutes. The analysis suggests Taiwan's legal system reflects a mix of influences historical civil law traditions from its past connection to mainland China, combined with newer influences from Western democratic legal thought and a rising awareness of human rights since its democratization. However, it hasn't yet developed the same kind of specific legal framework for regulating group hate speech found in some European countries. There might be ongoing debate about it, but it's not codified in the same way.
So maybe still evolving in this area, drawing from different legal traditions. The key takeaway here seems to be that even within the family of democracies, where freedom from state censorship of political views is a core shared principle, the specific lines drawn regarding speech that impacts others, especially vulnerable groups, via hate speech vary significantly. And these variations are deeply rooted in each country's unique national history, traumas, cultural values, and legal traditions.
Precisely. You really can't understand why Germany has strict Holocaust denial laws without understanding the Holocaust. You can't understand the U.S. First Amendment approach without understanding its specific history of dissent and individualism. Understanding these differences in legal landscape and historical context is vital when comparing restrictions across different countries. Not all limits are the same in origin, intent, or application.
That makes a lot of sense. It adds crucial context. It's not just that there are lines, but where those lines are drawn, why they are drawn there, and who draws them, through what process. Okay, now we've touched on how China sometimes uses that "you're not so great either" argument. Let's delve a bit deeper into their broader information strategy around this and the idea of shifting blame, or that interesting phrase, transferring flowers onto another's tree.
Yes. This refers to more active and deliberate campaigns, often orchestrated by the Chinese state or affiliated actors, designed to manage global perceptions, deflect criticism, and undermine the perceived legitimacy of critics, particularly Western democracies. The analysis describes it as using propaganda and specific logical fallacies to conduct opinion warfare and relentlessly promote the narrative of Western double standards, or hypocrisy.
Transferring flowers onto another's tree, that phrase really captures it, doesn't it? Like taking the pretty parts of someone else's situation to cover up the problems in your own, or maybe pointing intensely at someone else's weeds to distract from your own field full of them.
Exactly. It's fundamentally a strategy of deflection and misdirection. The analysis details several specific tactics used in these campaigns. One is the direct and constant accusation of double standards. For example, when Western social media platforms like X or LinkedIn remove accounts or content identified as part of state-sponsored disinformation networks, or content that violates their terms of service regarding hate speech or promoting violence.
China immediately cries foul.
Often, yes. State media and officials will immediately accuse the platforms and Western governments of hypocrisy, claiming they preach freedom, but selectively censor pro-China viewpoints or legitimate Chinese voices. They'll call it selective freedom or political bias, ignoring the platform's stated rules or the nature of the removed content, like coordinated inauthentic behavior.
So framing platform rule enforcement as state censorship, basically.
Right, blurring that line we discussed. Another major tactic is leveraging historical grievances. Chinese propaganda frequently brings up Western colonialism, historical exploitation, military interventions, or racism in Western history.
How does that connect to free speech?
When Western countries criticize China's current human rights record, its lack of free speech, or its actions in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, Chinese state media and officials often frame this criticism as neocolonialism, cultural arrogance, or an attempt to contain China's rise. They use historical injustices committed by the West to try and undermine the moral standing and legitimacy of current Western critiques of China's present-day actions.
So, using the past to dismiss or delegitimize concerns about the present, you did bad things then, so you can't criticize us now.
Yes, it's a way to change the subject and paint the West as inherently hypocritical and unqualified to judge. They also actively highlight Western internal conflicts and debates about free speech.
How so?
When there are controversies in Western countries about how to handle offensive speech, debates about cancel culture, arguments about balancing free expression with preventing harm, like the intense reactions following the Charlie Hebdo cartoons in France, or debates around campus speech codes, Chinese state media eagerly points to these internal disagreements.
To show what?
To argue that Western freedom is fragile, inconsistent, hypocritical, or not as absolute or universally applied as claimed. They use the West's own internal struggles and debates as evidence that the Western model of free speech is flawed or doesn't really exist in practice.
Trying to sow doubt about the authenticity or value of Western freedom.
Precisely. And these narratives aren't just occasional comments. They are widely and systematically disseminated internationally, particularly through China's global state media apparatus outlets like Xinhua News Agency, the Global Times newspaper, CGTN television network. They publish a steady stream of articles, videos, documentaries, and social media posts specifically designed to push these narratives of Western hypocrisy and double standards to global audiences.
So this is a coordinated, well-funded state effort to shape global opinion and push back against criticism.
According to the analysis, yes, absolutely. The overarching purpose of these campaigns seems multifold. First, to deflect international attention and criticism away from China's own severe human rights issues, particularly its pervasive censorship and lack of political freedom. Second, to weaken the perceived moral authority and global influence of Western democracies by portraying them as hypocritical. And third, to reinforce domestic narratives for the Chinese population, portraying China as strong, unfairly targeted by hostile foreign powers, and thereby strengthening nationalism and bolstering support for the ruling Communist Party.
So it's about controlling the narrative, both at home and abroad, using these specific tactics.
It appears so. However, the analysis stresses a crucial point. While these tactics, accusing double standards, shifting blame, highlighting Western flaws, might create confusion, sow doubt, muddy the waters in international discourse and resonate with certain audiences, they do not actually change the fundamental reality on the ground in China. Meaning, they don't alter the existence of severe state-imposed speech restrictions, comprehensive media and internet control by the party state, the silencing of dissent, and the inability of ordinary citizens to freely criticize their government or discuss politically sensitive topics without fear of severe reprisal. The information strategy is an effort to portray a different reality or create a false equivalence, not to actually change the reality of state control within China.
So it's essentially a tactic in an information war, a communication strategy, not an accurate reflection of comparable levels of freedom or restriction across different systems.
That's the assessment presented. Understanding the strategy, recognizing these tactics when you see them, helps you, the listener, critically evaluate the claims being made and understand why they're often fundamentally misleading when used to compare political systems with vastly different structures and levels of state control over expression.
This has been incredibly clarifying, seriously. We've covered so much ground here, from the nitty-gritty mechanics of censorship in China to the different ways freedom is understood, the reasons some people inside China might perceive limits elsewhere, and these deliberate strategies used to shape perceptions globally. Let's try to synthesize this now and look at the underlying issues that seem to contribute to these massive misunderstandings and communication breakdowns.
Yeah, it's been a lot to unpack. We've delved into the nature and extent of state censorship in China, the firewall, media control, vague laws, self-censorship. We explore the reasons why some individuals within that system might genuinely perceive limitations in the West and Taiwan, often stemming from that core confusion between different types of consequences. And critically, we've spent a lot of time dissecting that fundamental difference between consequences that arise from society, law, or private actors in a democracy versus censorship and punishment enforced directly by an authoritarian state.
Right. The crucial difference between, say, getting fired by your boss because of massive public outcry over something racist you said, and getting arrested by the secret police for criticizing a government policy. Not the same thing at all.
Not the same source, not the same mechanism, not the same recourse. Exactly. And the analysis points to several deeper underlying issues that seem to fuel these misunderstandings and make productive cross-cultural conversation about rights so incredibly difficult.
What are some of those deeper issues?
One significant factor mentioned is a potential lack of widespread education in critical thinking skills and what could be called democratic literacy.
Meaning people might not have the tools or framework to critically analyze information they receive, question narratives, or understand the foundational principles, checks and balances, and individual rights that underpin democratic systems.
Precisely. Or they may have been educated away from those things. Coupled with this, and reinforcing it, is the profound effect of closed information environments. If your access to diverse perspectives, independent analysis, uncensored history, and factual information about how other systems actually work is severely limited or filtered by the state, it inevitably creates a distorted picture. It makes it very difficult for individuals to form an accurate understanding of the world outside their bubble or even of the full reality within it.
You're only seeing a carefully curated slice of the picture, often a version designed to support a specific state narrative and discourage comparison.
Exactly. Then there's the powerful role of defensive nationalism. When national identity and pride become heavily invested in defending the current political system and the ruling party from any external criticism, it makes objective comparison almost impossible. Any critique is seen as an attack on the nation itself, reinforcing that flawed equivalent comparison or mirror strategy logic we discussed, and preventing genuine reflection on domestic issues or systemic differences.
It becomes more about loyalty and defending the team rather than objective analysis of facts or principles.
Right, and perhaps one of the most fundamental and maybe even dangerous underlying issues identified is that core misunderstanding we highlighted multiple times. The tendency to equate freedom of speech with the unrealistic idea of speech without any negative consequences whatsoever.
The idea that true freedom means you can say absolutely anything you want to anyone at any time in any context, and nobody, not society, not your employer, not customers, not marginalized groups, can legitimately object, criticize, disagree, impose any social cost, or even have hurt feelings.
Yes. And if that's your definition of freedom, a world with zero social friction or consequences for speech, then every society on Earth, including the most open democracies with basic laws against defamation or incitement, or just with strong social norms against bigotry, will inevitably appear to lack true freedom. Because negative consequences for speech do exist everywhere in some form. The crucial difference lies in where those consequences come from the state or society law and why.
This synthesis really pulls it all together powerfully. It shows it's not just one single thing. It's this complex interplay of systemic state control, pervasive informational barriers, potential educational gaps in critical thinking, intense nationalist sentiment, and these fundamental differences in defining the very concepts of freedom and responsibility that leads to these wildly different perceptions and often intractable arguments.
Exactly. And understanding these underlying factors, the system, the information flow, the education, the ideology, the definitions, is absolutely crucial for anyone trying to navigate global discourse today, especially conversations about fundamental rights like free speech. It requires looking past the surface claims, the accusations, the whataboutism, to really analyze the systems, the values, and the information landscapes that shape how people understand their world and their place within it.
Wow. This has been a seriously deep dive, thank you. It definitely gives me, and hopefully you listening, a lot to think about. It provides a much clearer framework for understanding these often heated and confusing discussions about free speech across different societies.
Happy to unpack it. It's crucial stuff to get clear on.
We've really journeyed from the specific mechanisms of state control in China to understanding the understandable but often misinformed perceptions some people there might have about other systems, to really dissecting that core difference between societal or legal reactions and direct state censorship, and even analyzing the strategic communication tactics used to blur these lines.
It is definitely a multifaceted topic, and hopefully breaking down these distinct elements helps illuminate the complexity rather than just adding more noise to the conversation.
Absolutely. It certainly makes you think twice, maybe 3 times, about what people actually mean when they talk about free speech and its limits in different contexts. And that really brings us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after this deep dive.
Okay, let's hear it.
Given how profoundly our understanding of even a seemingly fundamental concept like freedom is shaped by our specific environment, our national history, our education system, and perhaps most critically, the information we do or do not have access to, how can we realistically bridge these vastly different perceptions? How can we even have a truly shared, productive conversation about fundamental rights when the starting definitions, the experienced realities, and the available facts are so dramatically different depending on where you sit?
That is indeed the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you find common ground when the ground itself looks completely different to each side?
Pondered that one for a while. And hey, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope this exploration helps you think more critically about the information you consume and the conversations you encounter about these vital issues every day.
It's been insightful, as always, digging into this.
If you found this deep dive valuable, if it made you think, and you want to keep exploring complex global topics like this with us, please make sure you subscribe to the deep dive wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to have you with us.
We'll keep diving deep into the nuances.
All right, that's it for this one. Until next time, keep digging for understanding, keep asking questions, and keep thinking critically.